Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for making the time on a Thursday night. I am Hudson Kingston. I'm legal director at an organization called CURE. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of us, but we've been working on rural environmental issues in the state of Minnesota and in other rural areas and in other states for more than 30 years now. And I'm up in the Ely area on Ojibwe lands. And I will be talking about the use of public lands. So I want to acknowledge that these are lands of the Dakota and Ojibwe peoples that are currently managed by the state of Minnesota, but as we'll talk about, mismanaged as well. So I will be talking about how DNR has violated federal wildlife management rules and favors the timber industry. And by doing so, risks losing tens of millions of dollars in funding and also risks losing irreplaceable habitat that we by law have protected in the state of Minnesota. So as I said, we live in a settler colonial society. We have a lot of public lands held by the state of Minnesota, and these are managed principally by the Department of Natural Resources. Some of it is also managed by counties, but 5.6 million acres of land are under the oversight of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. 4.2 million acres of that are state forests, school trust land, and other forested lands that are subject to heavy logging. There are 66 state parks and 166 scientific and natural areas. These are largely protected from being included in the timber management program of the DNR. But what we'll really be talking about are these last two bullets. We have more than 1,800 wildlife management areas covering 1.3 million acres and 700 aquatic management areas covering 46,000 acres. And these are areas you would think would be, somewhat exempt from being overlogged by the forestry industry, but you might be surprised once you hear my tale. Next slide, please. So the DNR has a long relationship with the Minnesota timber industry, right? They have a forestry division, and there's also a wildlife division, an ecological protection division, parks, and then natural areas are each divisions as well. And all of those are under one commissioner. So you would think that the commissioner would weigh all of those divisions, more than four actually. But in actual fact, the balance has shifted and has for a long time been towards logging. So over time, the timber industry has exerted significant pressure on DNR leadership and our political leaders. Sometimes the pressure on DNR often is through our political leaders. And generally, the DNR works hard to assure that the timber industry gets the trees they want at the prices they want. So as I think Scott said at the outset, and I believe maybe Lucas also made reference to, Peter definitely made reference to it. Minnesota law constrains logging on public lands. We have good rules about how it should be done, but DNR must enforce laws for them to matter on the ground. And we've seen, at least in the last few years, that really is not happening. Next slide, please. So one interesting thing is that there's a large amount of funding coming from the federal government, and this money is coming from taxes and fees placed on hunters and anglers, purchases of bullets, guns, fishing equipment, and then hunting license and fishing licenses. For about 87 years, Minnesota and other states have received funding from federal taxes on these things under the Pittman-Robertson Act, which I didn't include in my slides. They have these fun names, very historic. But there's the Pittman-Robertson Act, and Dingell-Johnson is a second act that has been around for nearly as long and puts money towards aquatic management areas. The money is distributed by the Fish and Wildlife Service, so a federal agency, to states in 2-year grants that come with legal conditions. They can't just use the money on whatever the heck they want. Under both federal and state law, in fact, the money must be used to acquire land for wildlife habitat, manage that land, and conduct research for the benefit of the wildlife. It cannot be used to pay for logging that doesn't benefit habitat management, and it can't be used to produce income for the DNR. As I said a little earlier, there are two federal laws that provide this funding. And then under those two different laws, we get our management areas and aquatic management areas, the WMAs and AMAs. So yeah, this has been getting worse for a while. And in March of 2018, the DNR concluded a study that had started under Dayton administration that decided that it would be just fine to increase logging on state lands by about 9%, a little less than 9%. And importantly, it was not spread out evenly because, as I said before, there's already these state forests that are that had been logged heavily in the past. So in order to squeeze out that 9%, they had to increase logging on wildlife areas by 12%. In 2019, you may have seen in the news that a group of wildlife managers who currently worked at DNR wrote an open letter to their leadership, to the commissioner, saying that it was not scientifically accurate and not in compliance with the law to say that they could continue logging at this high level and actually protect wildlife areas. It was a major threat to the wildlife division's work and to Minnesota's wildlife areas and wildlife. And in the years since, DNR has established a computer program, an algorithm that picks timber to sell, generally overriding the judgment of DNR staff. Prior to this computer program, staff were the final call on what gets logged. Now, if the computer says you're going to cut down some trees and wildlife staff don't want them cut, they have to find other trees of equal value that have to be cut. So it's really, they're letting a computer program dictate what trees get taken and left. And we all know that there's going to be errors in a system like that. This has created an ongoing controversy among expert staff at the agency, retirees who know this stuff like the back of their hands, and the general public who have been tracking the issue over the years. So as I said, the funding comes from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they have conditions, and this money can only be used in certain ways. So in 2020, the Fish and Wildlife Service did some actual site visits to see how their money was being spent, how our federal taxpayer dollars were being spent. And they found significant damage to these wildlife habitat areas. They found that the DNR had essentially lost control of these lands, which is a violation of federal and state law, and given it over to the timber industry in a way where there was not DNR oversight of what was going on in these areas. So they documented numerous examples of damaged soils, 4-foot rutting in places that there shouldn't have been a road, too much slash or discarded wood left, which made it impossible for wildlife to get through and to use the area, invasive buckthorn introduction, and then lumber that had been stacked and left there year over year in ways that blocked wildlife from using their own habitat. So around 2023, last summer, for the first time in a long time, the Fish and Wildlife Service did take action. For a few months, they blocked $22 million of these grants. And like I said, these grants are issued every 2 years. So Fish and Wildlife Service has the ability to block them at any point in time, but every summer they come due again, and it's easier for them to just not give them the money. And this started a negotiation process between DNR and Fish and Wildlife Service. The money has since been unblocked, but one of the conditions currently is that DNR is not issuing new timber permits. Normally, you'd think, oh, that's great. Nobody's cutting down trees anymore. Well, unfortunately, these permits, the ones that have been issued for the last 5 years, are good for 5 years. So there's about 10 years of logging built into the system right now. The fact that they're not issuing new permits for the time being is an annoyance for the timber industry, no doubt. But the DNR is trying to prove to the Fish and Wildlife Service that, if they add like a checklist or they add a couple extra forms, that'll somehow comply with all the laws that haven't been complied with. And they're trying to unblock the ability to issue new timber permits in these wildlife areas so that they can keep getting the quartz that they needed under the computer algorithm. Both the Minnesota Legislative Auditor and the Fish and Wildlife Service Inspector General have opened investigations into this. So from the state side, it'll be what the DNR has done wrong. From the Fish and Wildlife side, it'll be potentially what the Fish and Wildlife Service has not done in terms of oversight of this money that's been misspent, misused. Often it was spent to produce income, and the money was used to facilitate logging in these areas, not to benefit wildlife. And then, yeah, I mean, this is where we're at right now. It's the Fish and Wildlife Service has no, we have sent in FOIAs, and they have not been able to produce any comprehensive environmental review document to cover the grants it has been issuing for the last 34 years. There's no EIS. There's no NEPA document that they can point to. All they can point to is checklists they've done where they've said, oh, nothing has changed since the last grant, therefore we don't have to do environmental review. So they don't have anything to prove that they did a proper environmental review in the first place. So the fact that the DNR is currently trying to propose additional checklists to go on top of the checklists, to me, brings awfully hollow compared to a comprehensive review of how this money is spent throughout the entire state of Minnesota. Currently, the DNR is still out of compliance with all of the conditions on this funding. You know, that didn't change just because they stopped issuing new permits. They're still allowing cutting in these areas, and those permits were illegally issued. And for the past 5 years, it's been issuing, there's a buildup of these permits that will continue to be used, even if there is this temporary negotiation going on. Also, as I said, there is a scientific controversy between experts at the agency and then the forestry department at the same agency. Normally, that would be sufficient to trigger an EIS, the highest level of environmental review, and yet there still is no environmental review for this. It's just shocking to me in some ways. Also, I see that my slide maybe got cut off there, but normally in a situation like this, the state would have to pay the money back. So we're talking about tens of millions of dollars, right? You know, the last 5 years of these grants, and just one set of grants was 22 million. So it really adds up. And it's unfortunate that we're still waiting for something good to happen. I think I have one more slide. Yeah, so this is where we're at. Similar to what Lucas was talking about, this has been a long fight. I've only been in it for a few years. A lot of other people have been working on it longer, but I am actively involved. But it's very concerning. You can't replace or uncut a 200 to 400-year-old white pine. You can't replace a 200-year-old deer yard in a cedar swamp. Those things, when they're gone, they're gone. We're not going to get them back. And some of the only remaining examples are in these wildlife areas that are on state lands managed by the DNR. Within 10 years of this increase in logging, which really kicked off in 2019, there will be very little old timber left. And key species like woodpeckers, owls, deer, grouse need old growth, or else they'll just die. You know, like all of the people who are concerned about how there are fewer deer up in northeastern Minnesota, you know, they have a lot of theories, but the lack of actual suitable habitat is what's going to kill them off. And without immediate action, we're just gonna lose our old growth trees on state lands, which is going to fragment what little habitat we have left. So I hate to end this with a bummer. But I did want to bring all those things to your attention. I'm sorry I took a bit more than my 8 minutes.